Wren Calloway found a bleeding stranger collapsed in her cornfield the night a flood cut off every road out of Ashford Hollow. She had no way to call for help, so she carried him into her barn and did what she could herself. She didn't know his name. She didn't know who was looking for him. She only found out 9 days later, when a line of black cars pulled into her driveway. Wren Calloway was 24 years old the night a flood cut off every road leading in or out of Ashford Hollow. And if you've ever had one ordinary night turn into something you never saw coming, stick with us tonight and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The storm had been forecast as nothing more than heavy rain, the kind Ashford Hollow saw a dozen times most autumns without much consequence. But the creek behind Wren's property rose faster than anyone expected once the rain wouldn't let up, spilling over its banks by midnight and swallowing the low bridge on the county road within the hour. By 1 in the morning, the power had flickered out across the whole hollow, the cell towers along with it, leaving Wren and her grandmother Opal sitting by candlelight in a farmhouse that had weathered plenty of bad nights before, though rarely one this complete in how it cut them off from everyone else. Wren went out around 2 to check on the livestock, pulling her boots on over soaked jeans, more out of habit than any real expectation of finding trouble beyond a spooked cow or a fence post knocked loose by the wind. What she found instead, half collapsed at the edge of her cornfield, where the floodwater hadn't quite reached, was a man face down in the mud, one arm bent wrong beneath him, a dark stain spreading through his shirt that the rain hadn't managed to wash away. Wren's first instinct was to run back for the phone, and her second, arriving almost the same instant, was the flat, useless memory that the phone lines had gone down 2 hours earlier along with everything else. She didn't have the luxury of standing there deciding what the right thing to do was. Wren got her arms under the man's shoulders, found some strength in herself she hadn't known she had, and dragged him, inch by inch through the mud, toward the barn instead of the house, some instinct telling her Opal, 81 and increasingly frail these past 2 winters, didn't need whatever this turned out to be brought anywhere near her bedroom. By the time Wren got him onto a horse blanket spread over the barn's dry straw, she was breathing hard, soaked through, and looking down at a stranger who was, by any reasonable measure, closer to dead than alive. The wound itself sat low on his side, and even with as little as Wren knew about gunshot wounds beyond what she'd half absorbed from television, she understood enough to recognize it wasn't a farm accident or a fall that had put it there. She used what Opal kept stocked in the old nursing kit from years back, gauze and disinfectant, and the kind of butterfly closures meant for far smaller injuries than this one, doing the best she could, with hands that shook more than she wanted them to. The man stirred once while she worked, eyes fluttering half open, unfocused, muttering something Wren couldn't make out beyond a single word that might have been a name, before he went still again. Wren sat back on her heels once she'd done what little she could, looking at a stranger with no wallet, no phone, nothing on him at all except the clothes he'd nearly bled through, and a heavy signet ring on his right hand that looked considerably more expensive than anything else about his current situation. She had no way to call for an ambulance, no way to reach the sheriff's office 3 miles down a road, currently sitting under 4 feet of water, and for the first time since finding him, the full weight of her actual choices settled over her. She could sit with him and hope he lasted until the roads cleared, or she could accept that hoping was, for tonight at least, the only option she actually had. Opal, when Wren finally went inside near dawn to check on her, didn't ask many questions once Wren explained what she'd found, though the look on her grandmother's face carried enough worry for both of them. The farm was already thin enough some months that Wren did the books herself, rather than let Opal see just how close things sat to the edge, a private worry she hadn't planned on sharing with anybody, let alone an unconscious stranger currently bleeding into her barn straw. Opal simply told her to keep him warm and keep him breathing, and that the rest of it, whoever he turned out to be, would have to wait for daylight and dry roads. Wren went back out to the barn a little after 4 that morning, checking the wound again, relieved to find the bleeding had slowed at least, and she was still crouched there beside him when she heard it, faint at first over the sound of the rain finally starting to ease. An engine, somewhere out past her fence line, moving slow and deliberate down a flooded road that, by any sensible measure, no one should have been driving down at this hour. The engine passed on by, slow and searching but never turning up Wren's own drive, and she stayed crouched in the dark barn a long while after the sound faded, waiting to see if it circled back, before finally letting herself breathe normally again. She didn't know yet what exactly she was hiding from, only that something about a car creeping down a flooded road at 4 in the morning, right after she'd found a bleeding stranger in her cornfield, didn't add up to anything good. She stayed in the barn until first light, dozing in short stretches against a hay bale, checking the stranger's breathing every time she woke. Wren and Opal had been running the farm together for 6 years, ever since Wren's parents died in a highway accident when Wren was 18, leaving her with more responsibility than most people her age carried, and considerably less money to manage it with. Opal had raised her from that point on, the two of them making the dairy and vegetable operation work through sheer stubbornness more than any real profit margin, and Wren had gotten used to a particular kind of quiet worry that came with knowing exactly how thin the farm's finances actually sat behind every conversation about weather, or crops, or cattle prices. It was that same worry, more than any suspicion, that kept Wren from immediately assuming the worst about the man in her barn. People in genuine trouble didn't always look like villains. Sometimes they just looked exactly like what he did, desperate and alone and running out of options. By mid-morning, with the rain finally stopped and the flood water beginning its slow retreat, the stranger came around enough to open his eyes properly for the first time, blinking up at the barn rafters with the confused, unfocused look of someone piecing together where he was and how badly that mattered. He didn't offer his name right away, though he did manage, in a rough, exhausted voice, to say one word clearly enough for Wren to catch it this time: Dario. Whether that was his own name or somebody else's, Wren couldn't say, and the stranger didn't clarify before his eyes slid shut again, leaving her no more informed than she'd been the night before, aside from that single word and the heavy ring still catching the morning light on his hand. The county mail carrier, driving the one stretch of road that had reopened by early afternoon, dropped an envelope in Wren's box that turned her stomach the moment she saw the return address. The bank had sent formal notice that the farm's loan, the one Wren had been quietly falling behind on for over a year without telling Opal the full extent of it, was now heading toward foreclosure proceedings if the balance wasn't brought current within 30 days. Wren stood in her own kitchen holding that letter, a wounded stranger bleeding in her barn and her family's entire livelihood suddenly sitting on a countdown clock, and found herself laughing once, short and humorless, at how thoroughly one single day had decided to fall apart around her. She went back out to the barn that afternoon, letter still folded in her back pocket, and found the stranger more alert than he'd been all day, enough to focus properly on her face and ask, in a voice cracked from disuse, whether she'd called anyone yet. Wren told him plainly that the roads had only just started clearing, that she hadn't called anybody, not yet. Something in his expression shifted at that, relief mixed with something closer to fear, and he asked her, with real effort behind the words, to wait a little longer before she did, if she could. He didn't explain why, he just asked, and something about the raw terror underneath the request made Wren nod before she'd fully decided to agree. She spent the rest of that afternoon telling herself it was simple decency, nothing more, the same thing she'd have done for anybody found half dead in her cornfield, regardless of what he was asking her to hold off on. But some smaller, quieter part of her recognized that decency alone didn't usually come with this particular flavor of unease sitting in her stomach, the sense that whatever this man was running from hadn't finished looking for him yet. She was carrying feed out to the chickens near sunset, the bank's letter still weighing on her more than she wanted to admit, when she looked up toward the end of her long gravel drive and saw it sitting there, in broad daylight this time, engine idling, exactly the kind of car that had no business creeping along a farm road in Ashford Hollow, black, expensive, and utterly still, as if whoever sat inside it was in absolutely no hurry at all. Wren set the feed bucket down slow, deliberately, the way you move when you don't want to look like you're reacting to anything, and walked toward the gate at the end of her drive, with her heart working harder than the short distance should have required. 2 men got out of the car as she approached, both dressed plainly enough, though something about the careful, unhurried way they carried themselves told Wren these weren't lost tourists or door-to-door salesmen. The taller one asked, polite enough on the surface, whether she'd seen anyone unfamiliar on her property in the last day or two, mentioning vaguely that they were looking for a relative who'd gone missing during the storm. Wren had never in her life needed to lie convincingly about anything more serious than finishing her chores on time, and she was surprised, standing there at her own gate with a wounded stranger currently hidden in her barn, at how steady her own voice came out. She told the men plainly that she hadn't seen a single soul since the flood hit, that half her fence line was still underwater, and that they were welcome to look around if they wanted, though there wasn't much to see beyond mud and a barn full of nervous livestock. The shorter man studied her, a beat longer than felt comfortable, before the taller one thanked her, apologized for the intrusion, and the 2 of them got back in the car and continued on down the road toward the next property. She didn't move from that spot until the car was well out of sight, and even then, she stood there a while longer, hands shaking in a way they hadn't during the actual conversation, the delayed fear catching up to her all at once. Whoever these men were looking for, Wren understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. It was almost certainly the same man, currently running a fever in her barn, and she'd just lied to strangers' faces to protect someone whose real name she still didn't fully know. That fever, when she checked on him that evening, had climbed considerably worse than it had been that morning, his skin hot and damp under her hand, mumbling things that didn't make sense even when she leaned close trying to catch them. The wound itself looked angrier than it had the day before, the skin around it inflamed in a way that told Wren, even without any real medical training, that infection had set in somewhere beneath her makeshift stitching. One of the back roads out of the hollow had finally reopened that afternoon, narrow and still muddy but passable, which meant, for the first time since she'd found him, driving him to a real hospital was actually possible. She stood in the barn a long time that night, weighing what she knew against what she didn't. A hospital meant real doctors, real antibiotics, a real chance at fighting off whatever infection was building in him. It also meant admitting him under whatever name he gave, in a public building, at a moment when 2 men in an expensive car were driving farm to farm through the same hollow, looking for exactly this kind of wounded stranger. Wren made the call herself, alone, choosing instead to dig through what remained of Opal's old nursing supplies for the strongest antibiotic ointment and fever reducers she had on hand, sitting up with him through the worst of that night, cooling his forehead with damp cloths and hoping it would be enough. It was somewhere past 2 in the morning, in one of his brief, clearer moments, that he finally told her enough of the truth to change everything she thought she understood about the last 2 days. His name was Nico, he said, voice weak but steady enough to get the words out. His brother's name was Dario Marchetti, and the 2 men at her gate that afternoon worked for a rival family who'd ambushed him days earlier over territory he'd never personally had a hand in fighting over. He told her, plainly and without much drama left in him to spare, that if those men found him here, they wouldn't simply take him quietly. They'd make sure nothing was left behind to say he'd ever survived the flood at all. Wren sat with that information a long moment, understanding fully for the first time exactly what kind of danger she'd been sheltering in her barn for nearly a week now, and understanding just as clearly that it was far too late to undo any part of the choice she'd already made. She barely slept the rest of that night, checking his fever every hour, and it was near dawn, standing exhausted at her kitchen window with coffee she hadn't touched, that she saw them. Not 1 car this time, but 4, moving slow and deliberate in a single line, turning off the county road directly onto hers. Wren stood frozen at her kitchen window, for exactly as long as it took her to remember that whoever these men turned out to be, running now would only make her look guiltier than staying put. 4 black cars came to a stop along her drive, doors opening in a controlled, unhurried sequence that told her these men had done this before, arriving somewhere with purpose rather than panic. She counted 6 men total before one of them, older than the rest, dressed simply but carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that made the others fall in slightly behind him, started walking toward her porch alone. He introduced himself plainly once he reached the steps. No threats, no raised voice, just a level, controlled statement that his name was Dario Marchetti, and that his brother had gone missing the same night a flood tore through this exact stretch of county, and that his men had finally traced an abandoned, bullet-marked truck to a stretch of road not far from her property line. He asked, without demanding, whether she'd seen anyone matching that description. Wren looked at this man, clearly capable of considerable danger if she answered wrong, and made the same choice she'd been making for 9 days straight already. She told him the truth. His brother was alive, in her barn, fighting off an infection she'd been treating as best she could, without proper medical supplies. Something shifted visibly across Dario's face at that. A controlled man's version of relief, brief and quickly folded back beneath his composure, before he asked her, with unmistakable urgency now, to take him to him immediately. Wren led him and 2 of his men out to the barn, standing back near the door while Dario knelt beside his brother, checking his pulse, his color, the makeshift bandaging Wren had maintained daily with whatever she had on hand, his expression shifting through something that looked, for just a moment, like a man realizing exactly how close he'd come to losing someone he loved. Nico, weak but conscious, managed to tell his brother enough of what had happened over the following minutes, how he'd escaped the initial ambush, how the flood had stranded him, how a stranger, with no idea who he was, had dragged him out of the mud and kept him alive through 9 days of fever and hiding, without once asking what she'd get out of it. Dario listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finally looked up at Wren, standing quietly near the barn door, something in his expression had changed entirely from the controlled stranger who'd first walked up her porch steps. What happened over the following days, Wren mostly learned about second-hand, or not at all. Dario's men moved Nico to proper medical care within hours, discreetly, under names Wren never asked about and wasn't offered. Whatever needed handling regarding the men who'd ambushed Nico in the first place, Dario handled somewhere far outside Wren's farm, and entirely outside anything she witnessed or wanted to know the details of, and within a week, the black cars stopped appearing on the county road altogether, the danger apparently resolved in whatever manner men like Dario resolved these things. The bank's foreclosure notice, the one Wren had been quietly panicking over since the day it arrived, simply stopped mattering sometime during that same week. A call from her lender informed her, with some confusion on the bank's end, that the outstanding balance on the farm's loan had been paid in full, in one lump payment, by a party that had requested to remain anonymous. Wren didn't need much guessing to understand who that had been, though nobody ever confirmed it to her directly, and no one ever asked her for anything in return. Dario Marchetti came back to Ashford Hollow 3 weeks later, alone this time, no black cars trailing behind him, no urgency in how he walked up the same porch steps he'd first climbed looking for his brother. He told Wren plainly that Nico was recovering well, that he'd wanted to thank her properly once things had settled, though the longer they stood there talking on her porch that evening, the clearer it became to both of them that thanking her wasn't really the reason he'd driven all the way back out to a farm this far from anywhere he usually had business being. Wren still isn't sure, even now, what exactly to call whatever started between them that evening, only that it felt like the first, genuinely good thing to come out of a flood that had nearly cost a stranger his life. If this story reminded you that kindness sometimes finds its way back to you when you least expect it, stay with us and subscribe, because we've got more stories like Wren and Dario's still waiting to be told.